Honestly, I swear that my thumbnail ideas just get more ridiculous each time. Anyway, it's rare for me to be absolutely obsessed with a TV show just after the first episode alone. It usually takes me a couple of episodes to get into a show, like I have to convince myself that I like it. But I was immediately obsessed with You. Not literally You, but the TV Netflix show You. And now that the fifth and final season has come out, I'm here to recommend some books to you to read after finishing the show. And if you're new here, hi, welcome, I'm Katerina, welcome to the channel. I make new videos chatting about books every single week, and if that's your jam, why not subscribe? Okay, on the off chance you actually haven't seen You and just clicked on this video anyway, this TV show follows a guy called Joe Goldberg who lives in New York. He's a bookstore manager who is charming, obsessive, and also just a sociopath. And one day he meets a girl who walks into his bookstore and is absolutely infatuated with her, and he ends up stalking her in person and also through social media, attempting any way possible to insert himself romantically in her life. And the series just showcases the crazy lengths that he goes to in order to achieve this. I mean, I'm an obsessive lover girl too, so on some level, Joe Goldberg, I get you. I'm just kidding. Maybe. Okay, so I'm going to be splitting these books into different categories based on the most prominent themes and traits that are shown within the show. Also, just a heads up, I'm going to be quite vague when exploring some quite sensitive things, because YouTube seems to love to censor anything that is slightly extreme. So just an FYI if you're wondering why I'm explaining some things in a bit of a weird and mysterious way. And kicking off with my first category, perhaps the most obvious in the show, we have charming sociopaths. Because quite literally, Joe is a sociopath who is undeniably very charming. I mean, man has to have a certain amount of riz to pull ladies like Beck in love, let's be real. So all of these books have narrators who really pull you in to the point where you're kind of rooting for them even though you don't want to, because you know that their actions are objectively bad. And starting off with perhaps the most obvious book here, we have the literal source material of You by Caroline Kepnes, which is part of a series that includes 3 other books. I've read this book but not the other 3, and honestly the plot here is very similar to the show, but I will say that Joe from the books is definitely more weird and actually kind of scary compared to the TV show. I think Netflix definitely mellowed him out, otherwise I don't think anyone would be rooting for him. Because we get a deeper insight into his thoughts, we see that he is more misogynistic and violent. Yes, the TV show has this running monologue also, but the narrative in the book is just way more intense. I also thought that the book was super interesting in giving more detail into his character background, because it just explains more regarding his motivations and his psychological makeup. However, if you want new material with a different charming sociopath, we also have American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. This is a satirical novel following a wealthy investment banker in 1980s New York, who also lives a double life as a serial killer, which honestly I would probably be too if I was an investment banker. And the book very much explores themes in consumerism and superficiality, along with this moral decay that started popping up in American society in the 1980s. If Joe Goldberg was rich and worked in Wall Street in the 80s, I would generally think he would be Patrick Bateman. These characters are surprisingly similar. Firstly, they both have this idea of dual lives. They're charming and successful in public, yet they secretly engage in super violent and sociopathic behavior. They also have obsessive tendencies. I feel like as soon as they have their eyes on a target, that's it. It's literally their end game, and they will commit the most extreme violent acts in order to get what they want. I also feel like they have similar ideas of this moral decay in society, as they're just a bit pretentious and snobby about things. And they both tend to be a bit judgy and turn their noses up at things that they're just not really a fan of. And another character who I feel like is very similar to Joe Goldberg is the talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith. This novel follows a young man who very much has a talent for impersonation and deceit. And one day he's tasked by a CEO of a company to bring back his son from Italy. But Mr. Ripley ends up becoming super jealous of this son's extravagant lifestyle and essentially ends up committing a very extreme form of identity theft. And this just then spirals into further deception to try and get away with his crimes. I feel like Mr. Ripley and Joe are probably the most similar when it comes to lifestyle and character traits. They're both super manipulative, they both know exactly what to say to those around them in order to get them to do what they want. And they also come from less privileged backgrounds, so you kind of get this sense of desperation from them in order to succeed, like they're willing to risk more to achieve what they want. I also just got more of a sense of panic from them both, like they were both very erratic in their behavior, and then afterwards they would just be like, oh my god, no, what do I do now? Which I actually really like, this kind of cat and mouse chase that stories have. I find it super engaging. This book is actually part of a series. I haven't read the others, but I have read this one and I would really recommend it. And my final book in this category that also includes a suspenseful chase of a charming sociopath is Notes on an Execution by Danya Kukafka. In this novel, we experience the final few hours of a death row inmate awaiting his execution. And the story is told through multiple women in his life, including his mother, his victims, and the detective that pursued him. And it very much delves into the personal and societal societal impact of his crimes, questioning the possibility of redemption and also the meaning of justice for those that are guilty. Unlike the other books, I think that this one looks more at the impact on others from the main character's actions, which I think is more similar to the TV show You, because we also get shown the perspective of Joe's victims and those around him, which really highlights the impact that sociopathic behavior has on others. Both of these stories also really take a look into the main character's minds and backgrounds also, and it really explores the idea of nature versus nurture for men like him, because, were they born like this, or was there something in their toxic upbringing that made them this way? I also like this book for dismantling the idea that serial killers are geniuses, because no, sometimes they are just narcissistic and delusional men who think that they're better than everyone when in reality they're not. They're just men who have harmful thoughts and are mental enough to actually action them. Okay, as much as I'm obsessed with charming sociopaths, it's time to move on to the next category, which Joe is also guilty of, and that's obsessive control. Despite this absolute devotion, this type of dominance is not romantic in the slightest. It's an obsession that's possessive, toxic, and the creepy cousin of yearning. First up in this category, we have The Collector by John Fowles. This story follows a reclusive man who kidnaps a young woman and holds her captive in his basement, hoping that he can coerce her affection. He's also obsessed with collecting butterflies, believing that an object holds more meaning when he can have it for himself. And the story is told through dual perspectives of this man as well as this young woman who's trapped. I read this book before watching You, and whilst watching You, all I could think about was this book. Like, this guy walked so Joe could run, because Joe definitely got that inspiration of that glass box from somewhere. Both of these guys are just very unhealthily obsessed with the women that they're interested in, and they initially have no intention to hurt them, they just want to keep them for themselves, because in keeping them trapped in these confined spaces, they have complete control over them, which obviously they both have some extremely messy perceptions on love and companionship, because it leads both of them into committing some pretty harmful actions to those that they claim they care about. And another book that definitely looks at this obsession and control, but in a bit more of a different way, is Perfume by Patricia Suskind. This story follows a Frenchman born in the 18th century who just has an extraordinary sense of smell, even though he has no personal scent of his own. And he ends up becoming obsessed with creating the perfect fragrance, and ends up resorting to unaliving young girls in order to use their scents to craft this perfume. I absolutely love this book. I thought it was such a cool and unique premise, because who knew that there were so many different ways to describe scent? I didn't, apparently. But this story is so similar to You in this idea of like this obsessive pursuit. Some of Joe's obsessions and actions aren't always driven out of love. Sometimes he's committed to an act out of spite. And the main character here doesn't have any romantic pursuits. He's just fixated on creating this perfect perfume. But both of these motivations lead to very violent and disastrous outcomes, showing the dangerous side that obsession can have, even if they both go about it in the creepiest way possible. Because hey, you don't need to go around smelling like a mixture of girls. Just saying. But another very creepy book that falls into this obsessive nature is The Lovely Bones by Alice Sebold. In this story, we follow the perspective of a 14-year-old girl who was unalived by her neighbor, and from heaven she continues to watch her family and friends as they deal with her death, showing this ripple effect that one person's actions can have on a whole community. This is probably less to do with obsessive control and more violent want, like we saw in Perfume. The neighbor here has a history of targeting young girls, so he's very much a predator as well as a psychopath, as he loves the process of having this power and exerting physical strength over his victims, which are kind of similar traits we see in Joe. We very much seeing him lust over this idea of power, especially when he's keeping these girls in glass boxes. He's very much control of the situation here. Plus, this book is great in showing the impacts that violence can have on the wider community, which is a different perspective that we don't usually see in books often, so I actually thought that this was quite refreshing. And switching up the narratives led by women, the next book I have is Boy Parts by Eliza. This story follows a woman photographer who is known for capturing explicit images of men. She's very self-destructive, and this erratic behavior ends up seeping into her work, as through her art she ends up abusing her position of responsibility through power and objectification, essentially blurring the lines of her work between expression and exploitation. I'll be honest, I actually didn't love this book, but I'm including it because I know many others did, and I do think it has many similarities to You that are worth mentioning. Again, it has this exploration into obsession. Both the main characters are very fixated on their subjects. The girl here is obsessed in capturing explicit images and goes beyond what's morally acceptable. I'm trying to be vague in order to avoid spoilers. Whilst Joe is obsessed in pursuing these romantic interests, however, both lead to very dangerous and disastrous outcomes. We also get a first-person narrative into the characters' minds, so we can see how they justify these actions, revealing their very distorted perceptions and overall quite unsettling insight into their thinking. However, another female book that I actually did enjoy was Eileen by Atessa Moshfegh. Here we follow a young woman working at a boys' prison in the 1960s, and she overall lives a very bleak and isolated life until one day she becomes infatuated with her new colleague, which is an older woman. And this obsession ends up leading her down a spiral of events that also include crime. Once again, this book also looks into the very all-consuming nature of obsession and how the character just experiences extreme tunnel vision when it comes to intense fixation. Like Jo, it ends up making her very manipulative and dangerous to get what she desires, which also sheds light on her inability to form healthy relationships due to her destructive nature. And also both her and Jo come from very broken family backgrounds, and therefore this chronic loneliness has very much skewed their perception of connection and leads them down a path to commit some pretty violent and erratic acts as a result, which isn't great. And finally, we are on to my third and final category. Whilst I've looked at books that have explored physical coercion, my next category is the control of the mind, and that is psychological manipulation. All of these books include very heavy manipulation, mostly from one person to the other, where the majority are basically abuse. And starting off with an absolutely controversial classic, first up we have Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. Oof, I'm gonna have to tread very lightly here in order to not get censored. Here we follow the perspective of a middle-aged man become obsessed with a young girl, and the crazy lengths that he goes to in order to possess her as his own. This book delves into the absolute pits of manipulation, possession, and also unreliable narration. I feel weird calling this book good because the content, but honestly, it is definitely an unforgettable one. Because as a reader, you so clearly see this horrific predator mask this devotion as love, when really you know what he actually is. I can't say it because of YouTube, but you know. And it's interesting to read how he justifies his actions, even though he low-key knows it's bad. It reminds me of the whole idea that even us as readers, we can convince ourselves of anything. I'm not saying that you're doing the horrific things that he's doing, but I'm sure you also do things that you kind of low-key know that it's bad, but like you kind of justify to yourself that it's okay because of X, Y, and Z. I'm going off topic here, but like I genuinely found this book super fascinating, and it's very much sits within the same realm as you, I feel like. It's definitely a heavy read, but I think one that definitely fits in this psychological manipulation category. And another heavy read similar to Lolita is My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. Here it's the other way around. We actually follow the perspective of a 15-year-old girl who becomes entangled with her middle-aged English teacher after he instigated it, to the point where they enter a relationship without anybody knowing. And it's not until years later, when other victims come out, does she realize the extent of this abuse. I actually just finished this book recently, and it was unbelievable. I gave it 5 stars because it really hones in on the long-term psychological impact that such abuse like this can have, and how some victims can go into this state of denial in order to cope with what happened to them. And even though the TV show You doesn't have any of these horrifically large age gaps, I think this is still an important book because it looks at abusive relationships and how toxic individuals can very much leave a scar on someone, and the more implicit and less obvious tactics that people use in order to manipulate the other person. And another book that also looks at this, but with the gender roles reversed, is Tamper by Alyssa Nutting. Here we end up following the perspective of a female teacher who attempts to become involved with a young boy who is a student. I have actually only just started this book, so I actually don't know if I'm gonna like this or not, but I've seen good reviews of it so far, and it very much sits under this psychological manipulation category. So it seemed very fitting to include it, and to be honest, I liked how it showed that boys can be victims of such abuse as well. And because of the main character narrative, we really get a deep dive into someone who has a very disturbed view of intimacy and very much challenges societal norms into how women who are abusers are perceived. I'm not gonna lie, I'm actually not sure how I feel about this book so far because it actually has a bit of a comedic prose, but we shall see. Because I'm filming this in advance, you can see my review on Goodreads, which I'll link down below, which will definitely have my review up by the time the video comes out. Or you can stick around till next week for my April monthly reading wrap up, which I will give a whole lowdown on what I thought of the book. And finally, my last book in this category, which doesn't include horrific age gaps, is Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. Here we follow the tumultuous journey of a couple's troubled marriage. The wife disappears on their couple's 5th anniversary, and the husband ends up becoming prime suspect. But as hidden agendas start popping up, the media frenzy intensifies and the investigation just spirals. I have actually also started reading this book as well, don't come for me for reading 2 books at once. But I'm actually absolutely loving this book in showcasing the unreliable narrator. We follow the wife's and husband's perspectives, and as a reader, you have to constantly question the reliability of what they're saying based on their experiences and opinions. You'll read one side and then think one thing, and then you'll read the other, and then you have to really question what's actually going on, which I feel like is very similar in following Joe's sole viewpoint, because I feel like he tends to distort reality of what's true. So as a reader, you're constantly having to think, is this actually true, or is this just how he's kind of weaving his web? I also feel like both stories very much explore this darker side in relationships, as they very much focus on the mind games and psychological manipulation that can come from within these dynamics. And there you have it. Those are the books I recommend you to read after you finish watching the TV show You. Have you read any of these books? If so, let me know what you thought about them in the comments below. And if you haven't read these books, let me know what other books you would recommend to read after finishing this TV show. I love these kind of books in this genre, so I'd very much welcome your recommendations. If you like this vid, please drop a like down below. It really helps my channel out. And please subscribe if you're new. I make new videos chatting about books every single Tuesday in any capacity I can find. As mentioned, feel free to follow me on Goodreads below. I update what I'm reading in real time on there. And also feel free to follow me on my Instagram. I do post my personal stuff on there, but I also post the books I read, letting you know what they're about and what I rate them out of 10. And thank you so much for my returning subscribers for being here. I love reading your comments. I reply to every single one. It honestly just makes my day. And as mentioned, I will see you in the next video, which will be my April monthly reading wrap up. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye.